Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library and welcome to Blender Sculpting Basics. If you're just getting started, you might want to have a look at our first course on the YouTube channel where we discuss how to install the program and then take a look at some of the object and edit mode features. So before we get started, just a hardware heads up. If you're working on an older computer or a cheap laptop, you might run into some issues. While we're not doing anything like lighting or special effects, even a little bit of moderate sculpting can be taxing on your CPU. So sculpting unfortunately works best with a lot of vertices, but more vertices means more processing. There are ways to reduce the vertice count as you go along, and we'll cover those a little bit later. For those of you that know, Blender mostly focuses on the CPU, so a good GPU isn't going to help you a whole lot unless you're doing rendering, which we won't be doing today. So what is sculpting in Blender? Sculpting is a unique way of editing a shape or object. So in edit mode, you usually select your vertices with the selection tool and then perform an action on them. And after you do that, some math is done and the computer calculates where the vertices go. And because of that math, it's part of the reason you want to try to keep your polygons to square shapes, your faces, whenever possible. Although some of the things we're going to do will reduce our shapes to triangles, but that's okay. So in sculpt mode, objects are edited with the brush instead of selection tool. And even though it seems different, it's actually very similar. So basically the vertices underneath the brush region will be selected, and depending on your brush and the options, the math will happen either as you move the mouse or after a certain time interval, which you can set. So when do you use sculpting? In our first class, we looked at object and edit mode, and you can basically do anything you need to do with a 3D shape in those modes, and sculpting is just more of a shortcut. It's also a lot more intuitive for working with things like curves and details. So sculpting also works best with a lot of vertices, so if your object is a little bit simple, you're either going to want to add vertices so we can use the tool, or you might be better off with the edit mode instead. You can also build things up with sculpt mode, but generally speaking, it's better to work with edit mode to build out your shape and then use sculpt mode for the details. Once you have Blender open, there's basically two ways to start sculpting. The first way is for an object that already exists. Keep in mind, you can only edit one object at a time in sculpt mode, and you can't just select some vertices and work on those. It's an all or nothing deal as far as the object goes. If you wanted to only work on a specific spot on an object, you'd have to create a mask or a face in sculpt mode, which we'll discuss a little bit later. The other way you can start sculpting is by starting from scratch, and to do that, you go to File, New, and then select Sculpting from the flyaway. We're not going to save the cube, and that will take you here. So it looks a lot different. It's a different layout. It's the sculpting layout. There's no grid, there's no animation timeline, and a lot of your layout tabs are now missing. If you wanted to get those back, all you need to do is hit the plus sign, and then General, and Layout from the flyaway, and this is our familiar default layout. If we go to edit mode, you'll notice that by default they start off with a very well-defined sphere. There's a lot of vertices there, and as I stated before, sculpting works best with a lot of vertices. This is the kind of concentration that we're looking for. So going back to sculpt mode, we'll have a quick look at the tools and then we'll get into the details. You'll see that they're kind of color-coded, blue, red, yellow, and a few more if I scroll down. And on the far right, if you wanted to get at the brush options a little more quickly, you can click on the little picture of the tools here, and that will show you a few more of the tool options. It's the same stuff you see at the top, just a little more accessible. So looking at the colors here, the blue tools tend to add detail, while the red removes them. Yellow are a bunch of distortion effects, Purple is for cloth effects. We're not going to look at that too much today. White is for masking. As I mentioned before, if you wanted to exclude a part of your object from your editing, you can mask it, and then you can scribble all over it without doing any damage. And then you have a couple tools that are multiple colors, and that's for creating faces, which is a lot like masking, except you're actually drawing on the faces versus blocking them from editing. So now we'll have a look at the tool options. To discuss the brush tool options, I'm going to stick with the draw tool. It's the first one at the top, but pretty much everything I'm going to cover will apply to all the other brushes as well. So the first option I want to look at is actually the second one over, and that's the strength, because I want to change it. So it's set to 0.5 by default, which means you're only going to get 50% strength when you start drawing. So when I click and draw at 0.5 strength, you can kind of hardly see what I did. It's a subtle curve of where I pulled out the vertices. If I want to get the full effect of the brush, set it to 1, do it again, and you'll notice I'm pulling the vertices out a lot more. It's a lot more prominent of a mark. The symbol next to the strength bar is for a graphic tablet, so if you were to push more or less on your pen, you'll actually get a stronger or weaker mark. Next, I want to talk about the radius. You'll notice that the radius is measured in pixels instead of meters like most of the other Blender options. That's because we're actually referring to the size of the brush on the screen. So I already drew one 50 pixel line right here. I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to draw another line. Again, it's still a 50 pixel mark, but because I zoomed in, I was using a lot less vertices, and you can see it's a lot smaller of a line. So if you want to do extra details and you're not worried about the actual measurements, all you got to do is zoom in by default, and you'll be able to work with more detail. If you would prefer to know like what measurements your brush actually is, so you can stay consistent in your scene, you can click on the brush menu, and the very first option, you change from radius unit view to scene, and when I do that, you'll see it changes the measurement to meters. Now we're actually measuring by the object and not by the screen. So if I zoom in, you'll notice that the brush size grows proportionately. I'll go ahead and draw my line, zoom out. Now you'll notice it's about the same size as the previous line I drew. So that's a big one to be aware of. Next to strength, we have a plus and a minus symbol, and that's just to flip the effect of the brush. So if I go ahead and click on the minus sign and start drawing again, I'm pushing the vertices into the object versus pulling them out like I would get normally. I'm going to set that back to plus for now. And one last thing I would like to discuss before getting into the menus is axis symmetry. So over the menus, you'll notice we've got this X, Y, and Z next to like a little picture of a butterfly. If I go ahead and click on X, now whenever I start drawing, I'm going to get symmetry across the X axis. So if I start drawing, you'll see I get 2 lines instead of just 1. I'm going to undo that. This time I'm going to do X and Y. So I drew 2 lines there, and I got 2 more on the back side as well. You can actually do all 3 axes if you want. That'll probably get both messy and processor intensive, but just to show you that you can do it, you can actually reflect across all 3 axes of symmetry when you're doing your sculpting. Now we'll look at just a few of the menu items, starting with the brush menu. We've already gone over radius unit. Normal radius is how sensitive the brush is to the surface of the object. So a helpful hint for figuring out what these sliders do, and there's a lot of them if you go through all the other brushes, is you try setting the slider really low, draw your line, set it somewhere in the middle, draw your line, and set it somewhere a little higher, and draw your line. So I started this off with a couple lines already drawn, just to show, again, it's about sensitivity. With a lower number, you see the stroke kind of fold over on itself, trying to conform to the bumps that are already there, whereas with a bigger number, the stroke kind of goes right through it. So that's a demonstration of that first option. The second is hardness. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 0.5. We'll set it up just a tad, clear our sphere, draw a line, set in the middle, draw a line. You can already see it's a little bit more steep on the sides there. Set it all the way up, draw a line. So basically the hardness is how far to the edge the effect takes place, and with hardness you get a very sharp line, whereas somewhere in the middle it's not so sharp. One more time with auto smooth. Set it up just a little bit. Set it a little higher. And I want to demonstrate these three in particular because you'll see them on all the other brushes as well. Set it all the way up. So it might be kind of hard to see the difference with just the regular draw tool. That's a little more extreme with some of the other tools though. The advanced topics we're not going to get into today, maybe a little bit with the masking, but other than that. Next up is texture. So texture is using a texture map for your brush stroke. Just to demonstrate, I've already got one set up here. Oops. Your texture has to be a grayscale picture, or if it's not a grayscale picture, only the black levels will come into play. And I'm going to set the strength down a little bit. And when I go to draw, it's a little hard to see, but it's basically a star next to. I'm not going to get too much more into it than that, but the other options will help you create an angle or an offset for your texture stroke. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Clear things up a bit. The stroke menu, I'm just going to look at this top bit here. So we've already gone over view and scene. It's the same thing. But the stroke method, thus far, we have been using the space method with 10%. And basically what that means is every time we move the brush 10% of the radius, the stroke draws a little bit more. So if I were to say increase the spacing a bit and start drawing again, you see it doesn't show up quite as continuous as it used to. It's basically drawing every 47% of the radius. So if I go more than 100, we're not even going to overlap. Another stroke you might want to try is using the airbrush. That might make a little more sense in certain situations. So with an airbrush, instead of moving the mouse, things are going to change with time. So if I just hold down the mouse button, the next topic I want to cover is both fun and a little dangerous, and that's dynamic topology. So we'll start off with our simple little default cube here, and we'll bring it in to sculpt mode, boost the strength up to full. And if I start trying to sculpt with this guy, you'll notice there's not a whole lot I can do. It's because a cube by default only has 8 vertices. Now to go forward here, I'm actually going to pull up the system statistics here, or the scene statistics. So now in the lower right we can see how many vertices and faces we have. It shows 8 vertices and 6 faces. So the first thing you can do to get a little more sculptability is create some vertices with subdivide. So to do that, you go to edit mode, right click, it's usually the top option here. Subdivide, 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 or you can go to the lower left corner and just add cuts that way. Once you do that, you can go back to sculpt mode, and now we can do a little bit more with it because we've got more vertices. If we look over on the right here, we're up to 1500 versus the 8 that we started with. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing is use dynamic topology. We'll go back, start over, and we'll go, into sculpt mode. Now this time, we're starting with our 8 vertices, and on the far right here, I'm going to move things out of the way a bit. I'm going to click the DIN Topo checkbox. You might get a warning, not always. Click OK. And now I'm just going to start drawing, and you see that detail is just put in as I move the brush. So it's dynamically created, describes. So now I'm going to go back into object mode, and you can see we went from 8 to 625 vertices. Go back into sculpt mode. Now let's say you wanted a bit more detail. The level of detail created by dynamic topology is in the menu here. If you click on DIN Topo, it starts you off at 12 pixels. If we want to lower that, we'll get higher resolution. So again, we'll click the box, and we'll start drawing. You'll notice the details are a lot smoother. Here, we'll go to the other side here. So the lower that number is, the smaller your vertices will be, the more faces and vertices you're creating. So now with 5 seconds with dynamic topology set nice and low, go back to object mode, and you can see I've created another 4,000 vertices. So that's why I said this is dangerous. On the one hand, it's a quick and easy way to create a little extra topology only where you need it. On the other hand, though, your vertices and face count can get astronomically out of control if you're not paying attention, and that'll slow your computer down to a crawl. So it's something to be aware of, but on the other hand, it's something that you really need in your toolbox. So I recommend that you get familiar with it and play around with it a bit so you know its limitations. Now that we know how to send our vertice count into the stratosphere, it's probably a good idea to learn how to bring it back down. And there's a couple ways to go about it. So first, let's go ahead and create a mesh, just so we can see the effects that our various reduction methods will have, because you can't get something for nothing. When you reduce the vertice count, you're going to wind up losing detail as well. Alright, that's a start. Okay, so our first option is actually in the sculpt mode menus here, and it's right next to DIN Topo, probably not by coincidence, and that's Remesh. Just to see the kind of effect we're going to have, I'm going to go ahead, click on overlays, click on statistics, and now we can see our vertice count from sculpt mode. So in the Remesh menu, we'll click on that, you'll see something called voxel size, and the voxel size is basically the resolution of the object. So it's set to 0.035 meters. I'm going to go ahead and double that to 0.07. Essentially double. And click on Remesh. And when I do that, things certainly got a little bit more pixelated, but our vertice count went from over 24,000 to just over 6,000. So not too shabby. I'm going to undo that, go back to Remesh, and this time I'm going to set the adaptivity. I'm honestly not sure what a good number will be, but let's say 0.01. I'm going to click Remesh again, and you see it changed things a bit. And what adaptivity tries to do is move your vertices from where there's less detail to places where there's a bit more. Perhaps it wasn't quite as apparent in this example, but that's what it tries to do. If you have a lot of flat edges and those edges have a lot of vertices to them, the vertices will be removed from those flat edges and pushed to the curvy areas. So that's Remesh. I'm going to go ahead and undo. And we'll have a look at another option here, and that is in the edit mode. So I'm going to go to edit mode. And from here, we go to the mesh menu, and near the bottom it says cleanup. And you have a whole bunch of options here, and I'm not going to go through all of them right now. We'll have a look at limited dissolve. Sorry. When I click on that, then click on the little menu in the lower left, you see there's a max angle. And basically, the more angle you have, the more it will affect the vertice count here. So you see, as I increase the max angles, the less vertices we have, and at the same time, the less detail we have as well. We brought the vertice count down to 2,500, so that was like a 10% drop by doing the cleanup to 19 degrees. So one more option we want to look at here. I'm going to undo that. And that is adding a modifier. And unlike most modifiers, this one will actually go away after you apply it. So typically modifiers will stack up in the modifier stack. This one, once you apply it, it'll disappear. So it's underneath the wrench in any of the modes. It should be available. Click on add modifier, and the modifier we want is decimate. There it is. Under here, you can choose the ratio of vertices you want to keep. We'll say 0.5. Click on the little arrow here and apply. And it cut our vertice count in half. The definition actually is still pretty okay. And you'll notice again the modifier disappeared, and that's kind of atypical for modifiers. So that's 3 ways you can go about reducing your vertice count. I encourage you to play around with it because each option has a little bit of a different effect. The last 2 topics I want to cover are kind of related, and they are masking and face sets. So we'll start with masking. Masking is basically protecting an area from being changed so you can work on something else. So we scroll down a bit and we have the mask brush. Go ahead and click on that. Do a little bit of drawing here. As I do, you'll notice that the vertices aren't moving at all. I'm just basically coloring the sphere. And now that I have colored it up a bit, I'm going to grab the draw brush and start trying to draw a bit. And as I do, you'll notice that I can manipulate everything around the masked areas, but the masked areas remain unchanged. And the brush has a little bit of an edge to it, so where it's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit more gradual. So that's a nice advantage to using the brush tool versus some of the selection tools that I will show in just a sec. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new clean sphere. And this time we'll use some of the selection tools. So if we scroll down a bit, you'll see we have the box mask. But if I click and drag, there's also a lasso mask and a line mask. So with the box mask, you click, make sure it's selected first, click and drag, and we have a mask just like we did before. I'm going to go ahead and select my draw tool, do some scribbling, and you'll notice the mask is unchanged, and this time the edges is a bit sharper. So going back to the selection tool, you'll notice we don't have a brush menu like we did before. We just have this little checkbox for front faces only. So it's off by default, and you actually probably want that, but in this case it's probably not so obvious why. So as I click and go around to the back, you see I actually drew a mask on the front and the back of the sphere by default. So if I go ahead and click front faces only, draw a selection there, and it won't appear on the back. So if you were selecting like a head off of a body, that way you'll actually select the whole head and not just the front. So I will go ahead and undo those changes there, and just to show you what the others look like, you've got the lasso mask, which is just like you would think, also makes a mark on the back. And then the line mask will basically just cutting everything off from the line down. We'll go ahead and draw a little bit here, just so we have some topology here. Once you have a mask, you can float through the mask menu to see some of the options here. And there's a whole bunch. You can either grow and shrink the mask a little bit, which is very subtle, but it is creeping up a little bit. You can also shrink it, sharpen it, smooth it. But one thing you probably most definitely will want to do if you're using a mask is clear it. And that is right here where it says clear mask. And once it's cleared, you can go back to drawing. One more option for masking you might want to use is kind of its inverse. So you'll notice we have invert mask among the menu options. To show how that works, we'll go ahead, get our selection tool out here, create a box. Front face, that's fine. So I've drawn a mask, go to the mask option. When I do invert mask, it just flips it around. So that's a nice way to select an area versus protect an area. Again, just to demonstrate, get my draw tool out, and you can see I'm stuck in the rectangle. So that is masking. Face sets work a lot like masking, but with a few differences. And the first one should be apparent because it's in the name, and that's face sets, plural. So we can have multiple faces active at once. Let's go ahead and scroll down. Just like with the masking, we have a brush and we have selection tools. We don't have a line tool like we did, it's just the box and the lasso. When you go ahead, make sure the tool is selected. You start drawing. It's just like the masking tool where you're not actually moving any vertices. Anytime you pick your finger off of the mouse button and put it back down, you're starting a new face. The colors are chosen at random, I believe, and they don't really have any effect over anything, just to show you where the faces are made. Now that we have a few, let's go ahead and pick up our draw tool again. So I do that, I start moving around, and it actually really doesn't do anything. That's because we have to go into the brush menu, and then for advanced, go to auto masking, face sets. Now, once I start drawing in a particular region, it won't affect anything but that face. So as you see, I am being restrained to this green area here. If I choose another brush, let's say the blob brush, don't forget to go back into the menu and choose it again. So this option is specific for each brush. Pick a spot. Once again, you're restricted to that particular face. So just like masks, there are a whole bunch of face set options. I'm not going to go into too many of them right now. Again, you can grow and shrink just like before. It's subtle, a little bit at a time. If you want to get rid of your face sets, it's not too obvious here. It's actually face set from visible. Click that. We go back to our default situation, which is basically a single face. So one other way you might want to use face sets is from edit mode. So if you go to edit mode and you're working with something and there's a spot that you kind of just can't get right in edit mode and you need to take it into sculpt mode, you can actually do that with the face sets. So I've got the area selected. Going back to sculpt mode, you can't really see anything, but if you go to face sets, face set from edit mode selection, and there you go. So you can take your selection from edit mode into sculpt mode, just like that. And again, the brush only works if you set the auto masking first. So that's all I really want to cover with face sets. If you were wanting to 3D print your creation, what you would probably want to do is go to File, Export, and the standard is STL. So you go to STL, name it, Export STL. And however you go about 3D printing, that's the file you're going to want to start with. So I know there's a whole lot we didn't cover, but I hope I piqued your interest and gave you enough to get started. Thank you for viewing, and have a good day.